It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 544, and it's May the 9th, 1982. There was a review of a book in the Wall Street Journal this week that I found very fascinating. I haven't gotten the book yet, but it was one of these things that really caught my imagination. It's a new book called Iran, the Untold Story by Mohammed Heikel, Heikal. And there were several messages to be learned just from this book review alone, and I'm sure there's much more in the book. The interesting point about this book review, it's the detail of the taking of the embassy in Iran and how the American government was told through messages of the State Department, don't bring the Shah into the United States until we have troops and fortification of the embassy because there will be riots and so forth, secure the area. So the Iranians knew that within 3 months the Shah would be in the United States. So they got the floor plans of the embassy, and they were able to take the embassy and weaken the guards because they had 3 months to plan the taking of the hostages, and the Americans were sending messages back. A desk officer, Henry Precht, was sending messages to the State Department that the Shah would be coming to the United States. So the Shah was going to be here. The Iranians knew it, so that both of them were making their moves, and it didn't just happen as it appeared on television, and it hardly ever does happen that way. And secondly, one of the things that kept the Shah hanging around for so long in Iran was that he ordered some new crowns. Now, he had one of the finest collections of diamonds in the world, but according to this book, he was dissatisfied with the crowns of his predecessors, so he commissioned Cartier's to make him a new one. And at the end of his royal career, he didn't want to leave Iran for several days because he wanted to take the crown jewels with him, and they were in the vault. The people that kept the vault were on strike, and everyone else around Iran was, and his personal guards couldn't find them, and they had to leave without the jewels. But what kept him there so long was still wanting to take the new crown and the new jewels. And as the struggle was going on, it began in January of 78. By May of 78, his wife, the Empress Farah, first heard for the first time of the name Khomeini. And according to this author who lived in the Middle East, she said, for heaven's sakes, who is this Khomeini? Now, that's important because sometimes there's news around us, all around us, that affects our lives, our safety, our future, our country. It's all there for us to see. And if you don't want to see it, if you think that you're the grandest empress in the land and that your Shah is going to have a new crown and you're going to go on living forever in that manner, you don't see anything else that's happening around you. So in all of that time, she wasn't aware that Khomeini was waiting there in Paris and getting ready to replace her and her husband and take over the government. And the important thing about Khomeini was that even though they didn't know who he was, they didn't really know who he was, this author says Khomeini knew exactly who he was fighting, and that is the difference in surviving and in the game of surviving. Know your enemy and know who you're fighting. And this Khomeini said to the author of this book, the Shah was nothing as a figure, and neither was his Savak, and that was a powerful army trained by the CIA. Ours was a revolution against the army, and he assessed the fact that you don't fight the Shah with arms. You don't fight arms with arms. You can never win. Khomeini said you cannot confront the army. Arms cannot be fought with arms. The only way to fight the army is to disarm it. And so when it came to the push and shove, the soldiers lined up with the masses and the people and would not defend the Shah, and that's how they won the revolution. He said, despite their uniforms, they were of the people. Do not attack the army in its breast, but in its heart. Appeal to the soldiers' hearts, even if they fire on you or kill you, because you will prove that blood is more powerful than the sword. And that is what happened. And I mention that because we live in a military area, a very highly concentrated area. This is Military Week out here in Monterey, California, on the peninsula. And we have installations here of the Presidio, which is the oldest Army installation in the United States. It's the spy school. There's Fort Ord. There's Hunter Liggett with a laser beam weapons, Kashawa with the satellites, the Navy Postgraduate School, the Monterey Institute for Foreign Studies that trains spies to go all over the world. And the point is that many of them listen. I get phone calls and letters from these people who are listening to this program, to this news analysis. And they know that when they go out and overseas to kill other people and to maim people and to help put in fascist dictatorships in those countries, that what they come home with is drug addiction or the Agent Orange with the possibility of deformed children and wives. It's carried on now, some of these diseases, and chemicals from Southeast Asia are carried on to the families. They'll come to homes that are worth $100,000 or $200,000, no savings. The Social Security money will run out. Hard to find jobs when they get home. Racism worse than ever. No education for their children. Transportation sky high. No place to live or to be educated. So why go all the way out over to these other countries to kill and maim? If they were sensible, they would study their own country. Being in the services is a job. You earn a living, but there must be a better way. And it comes to the push and shove. I'm sure that many people will put down the weapons. I know one in particular who was teaching killing at Fort Ord, and he'd been to Vietnam one time, came back, re-enlisted, and when I first started this broadcast, this was 10 years ago, he put down the weapons and the tools of teaching the weapons, stopped teaching the killing. They wanted to court-martial him, sent him to a mental hospital back east in South Carolina, and he got out of the Army. They discharged him. He asked me to defend him. I didn't even know him, but defend him on the basis that the military was lying to their people, that this was a country of assassins, of political chicanery, and that the armed services were going into a war that they had lied about. First, they thought about court-martialing and a court case, but then they let him out of the Army, and he's out, and we're still friends. And the point is that he realized that he was teaching lies, he had been taught lies, and later he was a victim of Agent Orange and had some problems with himself and his children. And at that time, it was too early to even identify what was causing those problems. But the point is that what Khomeini says is don't fight weapons with weapons. Fight and teach the Army or teach any person who's willing to hear or listen the truth about what is going on, and that's the only way to make a better world. You can't defend what's wrong and hope to come out ahead in the end. There was an article in the paper this morning onto another subject that is coincidental, not coincidental rather, to something I said a long time ago about John Hinckley. The trial is going on now, the very weak, feeble trial for the man who shot Ronald Reagan and Press Secretary Brady and a Secret Service agent and a policeman in Washington, D.C. over a year ago. The entire trial is a sham. It's similar to all the other political assassination trials. It's a weak prosecution. He's a poor, sick boy. Mommy didn't understand him. He wandered alone out there with nobody loving him. Send him home to us, and we'll give him the care he needed. It's better than a mental hospital. And they're pulling the same BS they pulled through all these other stories. This was a fellow that traveled around the country, worked with the Nazi Party, had funding, traveled with a lot of different people. And in this morning's San Francisco Examiner, an article from the Baltimore Sun, Hinckley's mystery girlfriend, their 4-year relationship could help reveal what makes him tick, and you better believe it would. He has a mystery woman that neither the defense or the prosecution has listed as a witness. He's known her for 4 years. She lives out here in California. She visited him in Lubbock, Texas, and she has not been asked to be called. Now, when I said that I believe John Hinckley was the John who was parked in front of my house in January of last year, and I made notes of who he was, the license number, called the Secret Service, and the FBI, after Ronald Reagan was shot, they came down to my house. They told me it didn't matter if he was there or if he was with anybody. That didn't interest them at all. And I said, if I'm sitting in my home and this man has done this much damage in Washington, it would be interesting to know who he is and who he has contact with. Now, this story comes out about his seeing her quite a bit, knowing her. She was into the music scene. She was in plays in Chicago, in productions there, an actress. And she lives out in California. Some letters he had, Lynn wants me in California. I don't have to have a college degree. And he goes out to her. This scene where I believe that was John Hinckley in front of my house took place about 2 weeks after an article in the San Francisco Chronicle saying that I made connections of the Nazis in this country and overseas to the murder of John Kennedy and up to John Lennon. This was an article in January, and Lennon had been murdered in December, just before that. And I was making the connections of Mark David Chapman, Lennon's assassin, to the same CIA group that had been part of the past political assassinations. And this was in the San Francisco Chronicle. And then a few weeks later, here's this fellow who has diaries on John Lennon and Mark David Chapman, who keeps copies of the Warren Report at home. He's following and studying the Kennedy assassination. He's the member of the Posse Comitatus, a group that want to kill federal agents. He's a member of Nazi groups throughout the country. He's telephonically in contact with people in Colorado, in Tennessee. He picks up guns that the prosecution isn't even talking about. This whole trial is a charade, as are all the other trials. But now they said in the paper this morning about this contact in California. I wrote down very careful description, and in my mind it's very clear who the woman was who was John Hinckley, and I'll follow that up next week. Call the Secret Service again tomorrow and the FBI and ask them why they passed this thing off for so long, because he had mobility, and he also said he was from Santa Barbara. They were from Santa Barbara, and they could be there where Ronald Reagan lives and hopefully try to shoot him there instead of in Washington, D.C., if they could get close enough to him. That is one of the most disgusting stories, to see this, that they've known for all this time about these other contacts, and the trial simply is limited to whether he was sane at the moment you shoot somebody. How do you define the exact moment when you have target practice and weapons and you travel all over the country with guns and ammunition and you can pick it up anywhere you want, and you're practicing your shooting and you're writing messages about the person and you're photographed in front of the White House and you've stalked them, which is pretty good, and emulating Artie Bremer, who shot George Wallace. Bremer was following Richard Nixon, and then he conveniently shot Wallace and got him out of the running against Nixon for those Republican votes. And this character, Hinckley, was stalking Jimmy Carter and then shoots at Reagan, which would make George Bush, the CIA director, president of the United States. Jack Anderson had an article this past week, Tapes Reveal the Chaos After the Hinckley Shots. And it tells about the power struggle that Alexander Haig had when he said, I am in charge, and got up there on the rostrum and wanted to ignore the Constitution and the line of succession. But what Jack Anderson said was that when Alexander Haig called George Bush, who was in Texas, in Hinckley country down there in Texas, they had much in common, the Hinckley family and George Bush, Haig told Bush on the telephone, there's been an incident in Washington. The phone wasn't secure, and this was the message. And minutes later, a telex message told the Bush party that Reagan had been shot in the back. Now, when Haig called Bush, he doesn't say why he's calling him or what's happening. He says an incident, instead of making it as serious as he is. And the implication here is that Bush wanted the attention and wanted to get back and wanted to take the attention off himself, whereas Haig wanted the attention on himself, and that he didn't use the Andrews Air Force Base to get to the White House lawn, that he used the normal channels, because unlike Haig, he did not want to appear to usurping the authority of an incapacitated president. Of course, he didn't want to appear that way because he was going to be the next president. So he just slowly went his way and got into the White House. But this article says that when Haig called him, he didn't even tell him the president had been shot. The issue of the trial, insanity finding, this is the headline of one article called The Freedom for Hinckley. He will be free and he can go home to mommy if they find him insane. Another article from the Washington Post Service. Prosecutors must prove that Hinckley was sane. Well, the prosecutors won't prove Hinckley was sane because they're not going to admit into evidence all the places he traveled, all the people he contacted, how he purchased the weapons, who paid for his staying at the Sheraton Hotel up in New Haven in Washington, how he got in the office building across the street from the CIA, and I got some information I'll share with you next week on the location of the hotel where he was and his relationship to the Central Intelligence Agency and the Secret Service, how Hinckley got there. Los Angeles Times has an article, Hinckley's mental state emerges as the lone issue. It isn't the lone issue. These assassins, or these pairs of assassins, or the one who is along with the actual gunman, have teams. They work together. They're seen in other states. They're seen in the same state. At the scene of the crime, they're present. They're photographed at the scene of the crime. And in comes the prosecution, who can't dare give a strong prosecution because the defense attorney, as I mentioned a long time ago, for this operation of the Hinckley family is Edward Bennett Williams at his office, and they represented everybody from Robert Vesco to Lucky Luciana to the Mullen Associates at the time of Watergate, and to E. Howard Hunt at the time of Watergate, Richard Helms, all the Watergate CIA, all the CIA establishment, and the organized crime figures and the mob syndicate. So with an attorney representing Edward Bennett Williams, representing John Hinckley Jr., I don't believe for a minute that the prosecution is going to try and buck up against it. Now, they tried that food testimony this week at the trial. The doctors got up who examined Hinckley, and they asked him if it was possible that he had too much pizza and soda. And that's how he ended up at these hotels and these locations and by the White House and so forth. That's sort of like the Dan White Twinkie case. They wanted to make it a diet. And Dr. Rosen of Lubbock said he gave him tranquilizers and so forth. But the question was, could he have too much food? And he wrote messages about the Beatles and John Lennon, and those were idols of his. They weren't his idols. You don't go around with the Nazi Party in various states in Illinois, Ohio, and so forth with the Gestapo and idolize John Lennon. This is more stuff coming out of the news media, and they just eat it up. Now, one of the important things about this trial is Brady's memory dims, so he can't testify. That was in the newspapers this week. Why can't Brady testify? Because his brains were blown out, and the jury may feel sorry for Brady. And you don't want him to be sorry. If you're going to try and get Hinckley off and back to the family, you don't feel sorry for him, so they don't allow Brady in so they can see the damage they did to his brain. They just say his memory is dim. His memory is probably zero. Nobody has heard or seen Brady talk except grunting some sounds or seen him walk. But God forbid you feel sorry for Brady, then you may be pretty hard on prosecuting Hinckley. So Brady is not identified. It doesn't matter whether he can testify or not. He could come in a wheelchair so they could see the victim and how his life is from this moment on. Now, they put a judge, U.S. Judge Barrington Parker, very good strategy in this case. They put a black judge on the case because then he won't look like he's prejudiced against this little Nazi rich kid, okay? They did that with the Rosenbergs. They put Judge Kaufman, and they had Roy Cohn, a Jew, help prosecute it, and Louis Nizer. If Jews are hard on Rosenbergs, then Jews aren't communists. And if blacks are easy on the Nazis, you know, they're not going to show the hate for hate. Okay, so they put a U.S. Judge Barrington Parker, a nice black judge who listened to the case and do just what Judge Kaufman prosecuted the Rosenbergs, but he's not going to be hard on Hinckley this time, see, because he's a Nazi. It's a reverse thing. He's going to let him off to show that he's not filled with hate. He's not going to justify, and he's not going to take in any evidence also of the background of John Hinckley as he listens to this case. There's also mention that he had newspaper articles about the Warren Commission. I said before about the slaying of John Kennedy and the diary of Arthur Bremer, who shot George Wallace, and the story of the John Lennon shooting. I published in Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped in 1972, the pattern of the American assassin, the domino theory of the American assassin, that James Earl Ray could read about Oswald and shoot Martin Luther King. Then Sirhan read about Ray and Oswald, so he could shoot Robert Kennedy. And all the assassins that would follow would read the history of the past assassins, and then that would be their role model. So now they've pulled out the Warren Commission report, the Lennon thing, the Artie Bremer. I'm sure that John Hinckley Jr., coming out of Lubbock, Texas, and Denver, Colorado, is his wealthy CIA family, didn't give a bean about George Wallace or Artie Bremer or anything about that political milieu. Most of these kids were too young to even go back that time, and I doubt that he really did care that much about it. He wrote scrambling notes, heroes are meant to be killed. But who are his heroes? Maybe his real hero subconsciously is Daddy's friend or business associate like George Bush from Houston, Texas, and the CIA multinational oil group that they were part of. Maybe he really wanted Reagan to be shot to prove to his dad that he could help Dad's friend, George Bush, get in. His father supported Bush's candidacy, and maybe he wanted Dad's approval. That psyched that one out, that he really wanted Dad's approval by making his friend Bush president, so he shot Reagan. That's more the script and nothing to do with those kinds of heroes. He wasn't brought up like that at all. Now, before I get to some other news, I want to continue part 4 on the Falklands, the British-Argentine confrontation, with just a few of the headlines and important stories in the news and some interesting articles pertaining to this subject. As I've said for a long time, for those of you who didn't catch the first 3 weeks that I talked about this subject, the conflict of the Falklands is the sea routes, the entree to Antarctica. Antarctica has been built up for years. It was staked out in the 30s by Admiral Byrd, by Adolf Hitler in late 30s, 38, 39, that there is atomic energy down there, there's desalinated water, there are roads and industry. It is a prototype for space stations. It controls that area, controls 3 major seas. It is strategic for future wars, Star Wars, space wars, and yet the British, the Americans, can't really talk about what it's doing there, what the trouble is, because we armed this thing secretly. We have had secret passes to get there. It is one of the best kept secrets of the past 30 or 40 years, the bringing of Nazis to this country, to Antarctica, to Argentina, to South America with the technology for the weapons for the next war. And along those lines, to update this week, the article in the San Jose Mercury this last week by George Will, also in the Washington Post, there's more at stake in the Falklands than the interest of 1,800 islanders. It took them 3 weeks to publish this. The Washington Post had no articles of this type. The New York Times had 2 up until now. And what George Will is saying, that the crisis has focused attention on the proximity of islands to important sea lanes, and the Argentine foreign minister recently said there is something much more important down there. The Argentine presence in the island is important, but the controlling of this area controls the South Atlantic politically and economically. Isn't that cute that they just caught on that politically and economically the sea lanes are determined down in that area and are of primary importance? Another article from the Christian Science Monitor this last week, Antarctic resources may spark the next worldwide dispute. And this article tells about the dispute of the Falkland Islands and the South Georgia Islands, and the troubling issues will present themselves in the neighboring Antarctic and surrounding Southern Ocean. Although it has no indigenous population other than penguins, the Antarctic is more than a block of ice. Now, that's a lie. There's no large population, but there are many, many colonies down there, well built over a long period of years. And then this article goes on to say the Antarctic region was singled out in 1957 for scientific study. They make a jump in this article from penguins to 1957 with none of the important and secret trips that were taken down to Antarctica and what went on down there. But the conclusion of the article in the Christian Science Monitor is there is an international framework here for proposals for the Antarctic Consortium, that huge multinational corporations maybe should go down there and take a look and get together, which we know they'll do. They'll take one more continent, serve it for their purposes, but there's something even more interesting about Antarctica. Now, one of the subscribers to World Watchers Back East, one of my great listeners who follows through, there are very many that follow through with articles on the subjects that I talk about each week, and one particular person has been following this Antarctic area right along with me. And I had articles from the National Geographic that I shared with you last week on that, atomic energy and the buildings down there and so forth. She sent me a copy of an article from National Geographic, October 1959, called What We've Accomplished in the Antarctic by Rear Admiral George J. Dufek, D-U-F-E-K, What We Accomplished. Now, this article, page 548, goes into Admiral Byrd's trips down the sailing ship 1939, the Byrd. And Admiral Byrd said, in quotes, "I believe the Antarctic will play a very important role in the coming space age. The South Pole is on a platform. The Antarctic continent remains stationary as all other points of the Earth's surface move from west to east with the Earth's rotation. Thus, a satellite is a polar orbit to be observed from the South Pole every time it passes around the Earth. Such satellites, when eventually manned, could be controlled better from the South Pole than any other spot on the Earth's land surface. By control, I mean give out instructions for the pilot to break out of orbit and land." The article goes on, National Geographic, Antarctica is an air hub of the future. In this era of fantastic, ever-increasing speeds, don't neglect the future importance of remote areas on the Earth. This was written in 1959. After the establishment of our U.S. Antarctic bases during the International Geophysical Year, that was 2 years earlier, we could land to the South Pole by aircraft within 5 days of departing from San Francisco. It's been a long dream to build a runway on solid ground in Antarctic equipped with facilities of a modern airport in the United States. And with such an airport, we can fly planes in and out 12 months a year. Furthermore, it will open the era of trans-Antarctic flights between Australia and New Zealand. I mentioned those last week, from South Africa to Australia to Antarctica and then New Zealand, and South America and Africa, just as many U.S. planes are traveling today. And it discusses the growth of population in other areas and possibly using this to confront that. It refers to the growth of populations on the other continents. Today, if you wish to fly to South America, New Zealand, it tells you how if you use the Antarctic route, you can save 8,600 miles. Someday, an airstrip of at least 5,000 feet will be constructed there, and that will be a great day for Antarctica and the whole southern area. And it refers to the Pan American World Airways flying down there with particular stewardesses, and that it will become a tourist paradise. I'm sure like Guyana. Remember how Jim Jones sold Guyana to various members of our population, and over 900 died down there? Well, this article in 1959 in the National Geographic was saying, as a matter of fact, Argentine and Chilean ships already take tourists to the northernmost fingers of Antarctica, and when the snow melts, there's ice skating, hiking, mountain climbing, and etc. An even more interesting section from a book that was sent to me by the same person. It's called Antarctica, My Destiny, The Personal History of the Last of the Great Polar Explorers by Captain Finn Ronne, R-O-N-N-E, published in 1979 by Hastings House. Now, this has to do with General Curtis LeMay, and who was chief of the Air Corps Research and Development, working with Mr. Ronne. Curtis LeMay was one of the persons on the board of directors of National Geographic that was particularly interested in this magazine in the Antarctic area and the explorations down there with members of the CIA. Mr. Ronne talks about his work with Office of Naval Research and with the North American Newspaper Alliance, who were to buy his stories about Antarctica. Now, Priscilla Johnson from North American Newspaper Alliance worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union. This was an alliance set up by the Central Intelligence Agency, and that is the syndicated news that you were to get from Antarctica by these explorers. Now, Admiral Byrd lived a block away from this Mr. Ronne, and he describes in 1946 the Operation High Jump. That's the one I described several weeks ago on this program, of Admiral Byrd and Navy operation, how they went down there. And this particular person was competing with Admiral Byrd, and Byrd thwarted everything he did and didn't want to share the information when they first started out. When he wanted to go down there and get money to go down to explore, he said, I had a powerful opponent, one determined to thwart my interest in the U.S. role of discovery of exploration. Although I was an immigrant from Norway with no American family ties or powerful connections, my interests were similar to Byrd. But Byrd wanted monopoly of Antarctica. It wasn't a free area. that people could go down and explore, and it never has been. It's been a top secret area where, as I say, you have to have special permission, you get fingerprinted and so forth, and it's very hard to get there. This book describes the relationship of Lowell Thomas to the people going to Antarctica, and of course Lowell Thomas worked both with the Central Intelligence Agency, Lawrence Arabia, and many relationships to our spy agencies in this country while he was live as a newspaper man. This fellow finally gets into a working relationship with Admiral Byrd, and they share information, and he wrote to him in a letter. He complained to Senator Francis Case that the polar matters were controlled by the Pentagon people, sympathetic to Admiral Byrd's interests, and he had reason to believe they would block his expedition, said Byrd considers Antarctica his own country, and there's no competition in this field. I'll take a break now. It's 30 minutes. We'll take a 1-minute break and go on to the importance of the Falklands and that part of the world to the United States military.
This concludes the first.
Okay, now we'll get back to the importance of Antarctica. When this one explorer wanted to go down there and see what was down there and explore this continent, which he should have been allowed to do. We explored other continents and were able to travel back and forth. There was a column written by Drew Pearson that reported, they said they intend to tell Admiral Richard Byrd, the famous polar explorer, that they don't want this party who wanted to go down and investigate the area, they don't want him to head the upcoming Antarctic explorations. They favor a junior officer who Byrd took under his wing, then Commander Finn Ronne, R-O-N-N-E, instead. The Navy is still backing Admiral Byrd. He has strong support in the Senate, where his brother, Virginia's potent Harry Byrd, and his in-laws, the long-faced Senator Leverett Saltonstall, blocked funds for the Antarctic expeditions for other people. This was written up in a book that Drew Pearson exposed the fact that Admiral Byrd and his brother in the Senate were holding up the explorations of other persons who wanted to get down to Antarctic. And this book is evidently, I got sections of it copied, I don't have the whole book yet, is the politics of who can get down there, who can see the facilities, and who can explore. And then the author says, in 1961, I went on the lecture circuit, and in Hamburg, Germany, the U.S. information officer informed me that there's a family living there I would like to meet. His name was Captain Alfred Ritscher, R-I-T-S-C-H-E-R, and I recognized the name immediately. In 1938 and 39, he led a German expedition to the coastal areas off Queen Maud Land in the Norwegian sector of Antarctica. Now, that's the man whose name I mentioned is on the maps of the National Geographic, printed. I have 2 copies of 1957 and 1963. He's the man that Adolf Hitler sent down to Antarctica to stake a territory that he could go to in case the going got rough in Europe after he intended to invade Poland. And the stories that I've put on the air or the information I've had were these ships from Norway that escorted them down there later. So it was in the Norwegian section, which fits in this book sections I received this week, fit in with the map and the material that I have that preceded before I received this about the trip. This fellow was in Germany and met Mr. Ritscher, and he was the fellow who was sent by Hitler to discover and claim land in the Antarctic. The expedition did an excellent job, the Germans that Hitler sent. As I learned after World War II ended, a friend of mine with the Department of Interior said there are volumes in his office, 2 volumes of the Schwabenland expedition. Now, there's no map since World War II that has the German section, even though it was staked out and had a name. And Germany is still Germany after World War II, East and West Germany. But Captain Ritscher spoke with some English, and he talked about his flights and so forth, and about his trips to Antarctica, which I think is interesting because the fellow that finally went down there was able to explore, was able also to meet this Ritscher who had staked out this land for the Germans in the Norwegian section down in Antarctica. And as I say, they worked with this North American Newspaper Alliance, which came out of Harvard. Priscilla Johnson worked for the Soviet department at Harvard, where a large group of the people who were involved in the Navy intelligence part of Lee Harvey Oswald's assignment in the Soviet Union when he was sent over there came from Harvard University. And Priscilla Johnson was one of those. Later, she came back to this country and wrote Marina and Lee, and as soon as Lee was assassinated, she swept right in and took care of Marina Oswald and literally had her mind controlled for a long, long time. Marina doesn't trust Priscilla now. That finally wore off. But these people, Curtis LeMay, military, Admiral Byrd, the Newspaper Alliance of America, the secretive actions going on all the time since 1933 down there have been printed somewhat. I'm reading and sharing with you published material, but it has never been analyzed by the major news media or exposed or questions asked about what is going on down there. As a matter of fact, this week in our Carmel area, they had a program that I'm sure is going around the country on the Saudi Arabian families in Saudi Arabia, and it showed the villas that they have and how water used to be brought in by donkeys, and now they have large estates with water. And on this program, they said that the water is desalinated and they have large compounds of family homes. Well, National Geographic says that they use desalinated water for the living down in Antarctica, and Saudi Arabia uses it. And that, again, brings up the question of how come some people are starving from drought and other people are surviving very nicely on this technology that we're not allowed to know about or to be shared all over the world. Now, there were other articles on Argentina. The Wall Street Journal had one this week. Argentina's nuclear weapon capability estimated to be closer than thought. You better believe. And I mentioned the NBC program of taking the parts of the German atomic bombs down to Argentina, and a top German scientist working down there with them and going back and forth. There was a New York Times story this week about a murder in Argentina stirs political activists, and then it tells about over 11,000 people just killed or disappeared in the past few years. It's been more than that, but just last week they abducted another person who had been working in a labor union, but they just swept in and took her away. She was a one-time member of the Allied Socialist Workers' Party, outlawed, and they just took her away. She'll never be seen again. Another story in the New York Times, Argentina debates penguin slaughter. They're considering killing 48,000 penguins. If the factories are built already, they're doing it. There's no considering that tells where the factories are. And they're making gloves and purses, and then they said that the protein is 83.5% of the penguin meat. That's a lot of protein. They asked how you're going to kill these animals with this factory there, because so many people have objected to the clubbing of the baby seals up in Canada. And the question was asked, and the answer was they thought it would be chemicals. So if you kill the penguins with chemicals and then you sell the protein for meat, be careful. I mean, that's it. And I'm sure that that's another form of genocide if you want to do it. So look out where you're buying your purses and gloves pretty soon, if you'll know the difference. And this is one thing that's going down there, is the chemical flying a penguin, making products, selling meat, and getting rid of people at the same time. You've got to give these people credit. I mean, they're not dumb. When I say know your enemy, the average person has a mentality of, say, the Shah's wife, and that's not very high. And you have to read these stories in these newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Years ago when I was on KLRB, when I first started here, it'll be 12 years starting the programs this coming June, people would say, where are your sources of information? And if I gave the Berkeley Barb, the LA Free Press, the Underground Press, or Overthrow, they'd say, oh, well, you can't believe that. You could believe it. Everything that I read or put on the air, I believed, and is checked out as far as I could, was true. And just because it was printed by an alternative lifestyle didn't mean it wasn't true. So now that all those free presses are out of business, the Berkeley Barb and all the counterculture, most of them, the newspaper, incidentally, the City on a Hill up at Santa Cruz, is doing a good job, a darn good job of articles and exposés of corporations such as Bechtel and so forth. But there aren't many doing this anymore. And now when I give sources like the Washington Post and New York Times, people still, they don't ask where are your sources, but they're not seeing the stories that are right in front of them that have tremendous implications. I remember the dildrine in the school lunch programs that causes cancer that was coming out of the chicken farms in Mississippi going to Illinois and Detroit. And we could safely say, well, 6 or 8 years from now, those kids will have cancer and a big uprate of cancer in blacks. So if the penguins get there doing in with poisons, and then the food is set out to eat, somebody else is going to suffer years from now, and you can be sure of that. A gentleman involved and very much involved with the National Geographic that has published 70 to 80 articles on Antarctica passed away this last week, Melville Grosvenor. And the interesting thing about his life were the details of his work. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. He was very interested in Antarctica. That was one of his favorite subjects, and also in conservation, but in the Antarctica. And he was the one who launched the expeditions to Mount Everest and Antarctica. And his great-grandfather, Gardner Hubbard, began the National Geographic, but his grandfather, his mother's father, was Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. So the family that have the National Geographic came from a exploratory family that were interested in space, polar, and undersea research. Those were their hobbies, oceanography, and so forth. So they have followed very carefully. And on their board of directors, as I say, are people very interlocking with the intelligence community, with the secrecy, including that Earl Warren as part of the National Geographic, and Curtis LeMay, and the head of Pan Am. I mentioned them last week. Quite a list of board of directors in addition to the scientists. But when these men pass away and you read the obituaries, you get a certain view of history that fills in some of the pieces. Ted Zolk had an article in the New York Times. The Soviets' interest in the Falklands may signal a new hard line. And what he's saying is that so far, to paraphrase it, we have attacked the Soviet Union for about 40 years, and before the end of World War II. We ended up with them as allies in World War II, and the minute the war was over, we have attacked them verbally, socially, economically, treated them like vermin and lice. And what they're saying is the Soviet Union may stop being nice guys when Brezhnev goes down, and we better be particular that when the Soviets change, and they have an interest down there in the Falklands also, and they have an interest in Argentina. And the two things they have in common with Argentina, besides wheat, are the way we tell them how to run their country with human rights, while we do very little for blacks, prisoners, and Indians in our country. So this article, Ted Zolk is one of the better writers, and he says the Soviets may have a new hard line, and what you and I are going to have to live with were all the lies and the assaults on those people for all these years. If we sat back and took it, then we have to sit back and take their anger no matter who they line up with. And now the chickens are going to come home to roost, and that's why this Antarctic subject is so interesting, because all of the chicanery and all the lies and all the antagonisms are causing people that we thought were allies to line with us, and they're going against us. Countries like Cuba, where the communists are killed in Argentina, are lining up with Argentina, and the way the Allies are teaming is the subject of another article this week that is interesting. Now, the Spotlight, a newspaper put out by Liberty Lobby, has an article by Mitchell Werbel. He's worked for the CIA. He's a white Russian. He's worked with the Nazis from World War I, World War II, headed up assassination teams, created those silencers. He's writing an article, The U.S. must reaffirm their support for the integrity of the Americas. We must line up with the Antarctica, Falkland, Argentine connection. The U.S. must act forthwith and consider our alliance with Argentina and break from the British. This is where the power is going, down to that southern cone. Adolf Hitler said, give me South America and I'll own America. That's what he said, forget America for the time being. The Washington Post has another article on the Soviets by a different writer. The Soviets expect gains from the Falkland crisis. They will have gains. A story from the San Francisco Chronicle, Venezuela aid to Argentina, reported in the United States. Another one, Peru, Bolivia, and Venezuela back Argentina. Spotlight had another article, Who Profits from the Argentine Crisis? A question and answer. Now, this is from the far right wing, and they want to keep the Falklands. It's a story about keeping the Falkland Islands, British Association, and there's an interview. Why are the Falkland Islands so important? Answer. They are a strategic position covering the dependencies, Antarctic territory and South Atlantic, so coveted by the Soviet Union as a naval base and by African countries and so forth. The waters around them are excellent fishing, and there's large oil fields, the Falklands, and the dependencies, the British Antarctic territories. There's extensive valuable minerals, multinational corporations, uranium deposits, and so forth, and energy sources. Who is the enemy is one of the questions asked. The real enemy is not a nation, but a member of organizations. Now, they go back and they want to blame a early conference of one world people starting in 1860. It's a simplistic answer, but their explanation goes back to before even the Soviet Union existed. It says, what is the attitude of the British Foreign Office? It says, when the Whitefish Authority and the Falklanders worked out a plan for a fishing industry that could be set up and fish flown to England to replace the fishing industry destroyed before, the Foreign Office vetoed the project. Britain wouldn't buy the fish from their own Falkland people when they had a chance to do it. It said when Shell and Esso were drilling in the oil fields outside the Falkland, the British refused to allow a British company to drill for oil. And the point about this is that I think that Britain and the United States have been undermined to turn the oil and turn the minerals over to a particular group of people, and those people are not in the best interest of the individual countries, but a handful that have nestled down in this southern area. It says, this interview said that the Foreign Office has been negotiating under the ground to turn over the Falklands to the Argentine and encouraging Argentine to hasten the invasion. And the last question asked is, what is Alexander Haig's position? And the answer, as with the British Foreign Office, the State Department in Britain has been filled, and in the United States, with people whose allegiance is not to their country. In this matter, Mr. Haig is acting as an agent of a multinational and not the United States of America. Now, Haig is the president of United Technologies. He was making $1 million a year before he took on the job as Secretary of State. United Technology will make the engines for the spaceships, the space satellite stations. The Attorney General is Mr. William French Smith is the attorney for Rockwell, that makes the motors for the space colonies and space stations. These people represent business, and even Liberty Lobby says that the State Department has no allegiance. They are agents of multinationals, not the United States of America. And I have said for many, many years that Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and Mr. Brzezinski serve something other than the United States. You could take them all and throw them out, or hang them by the heels like Mussolini, which really should be done someday instead of giving them the dignity of interviews and so forth. It's a disgusting case the way they have thrown this country around since World War II and brought us to the brink of so many calamities. Another article in the Los Angeles Times, caught in our own noose. The first mistake for Haig was an alliance with the Argentine military. And it goes about how close he was, how Argentina plotted a coup in Bolivia that actually was encouraged by Washington, that Washington encouraged Argentina in every matter of internal affairs, and that Haig was instigating these people to go ahead and take these moves, and the article is called Caught in Our Own Noose. Another story, the Falklands are a missile test ground. The military doesn't have to lose at any angle. They can keep getting appointments when they have a war. They get new medals, new stars. They sit home. They don't do the fighting. You don't see the big brass out there in those freezing waters and waves. And this is first post-World War II naval campaign. This is what Project Paperclip was about. This is what the Nazi rocket scientists, the missile scientists, Boeing, Lockheed, General Dynamics, you name it, the Fairchilds, this is what they wanted. They're making these toys. How many toys can you have before you start testing them? And another story by Joseph Kraft on Atlantic War, how it could start. It said, first we should have let them know there was no separation of us between Britain instead of encouraging Argentina as the aggressor. And it goes into the problem of losing now our allies, the Brazilians, the Mexicans, Venezuelans, Chileans, and so forth, that we tried to act neutral, and everybody knows which side the Reagan administration has been on it ever since Reagan's inauguration. There was an article last week, the most expensive inauguration in history. I think it cost 14 or 16 million, but a big hunk of it came from these people that are down there, such as Licio Gelli and the fascists from Italy that have dual citizenship between Argentina and Italy that are down there now. Another story in the Los Angeles Herald, it's going to be another Vietnam, Argentina, and the U.S. and the Falklands. Mario Oblado from California, Democratic primary, was running for governor in the primary, Latin American. He's favoring, I'm for Argentina very much. He's trying to act as a liberal Democrat in California. You know how long he'd last in Argentina? He'd have his hands and fingers cut off in 10 minutes. I mean, off with him. He would be one of the 350,000 missing people, or recently the 11,000 dead. Oblado would last 10 minutes in Argentina. And with his political stance that he's trying to run for, but in this case, he's favoring Argentina. It's so easy to do that from California in the position you're in. Spotlight also has a story, Britain terrified by Gaucho bomb. We told you an article last February the 8th, Argentina had nuclear capability and how it was achieved. And they say now the media is trying to blame the Nazis behind it. It's not just Nazis alone. It's a lot of big money that has allowed the Germans to transfer this technology from Germany down to Argentina. Sure, the German scientists and the Nazis designed it, but it's very important to know that not Nazis alone have made this mess in these various countries. Another story, Britain no longer rules the waves. There could be a time when America no longer rules the waves. And from the London Times, the perils of shuttling. I've been getting the London Times, the Sunday London Times. What made the Hague mistake controversial, his mission controversial, even before he got his policy instructions for even-handedness, was that the Reagan administration wanted to give this trip to George Bush. It would have made sense to keep Hague in Washington, but Hague succeeded in persuading the president to let him undertake the task. Apart from his deep concern of a risk of war, he saw in it a dramatic opportunity to strengthen his own position. How long does Hague have to be the superstar on top of the television, carrying every battle, going into Libya, going into Poland, going into Argentina, surrounding Castro, pushing the elections in El Salvador, this outright murderer and fascist? But Hague, according to the London Times, he wants to be in there. As the world watched him super shuttling from Washington to London to Buenos Aires and London with fascination and uneasiness and watching his physical stamina, Hague carried on heroically, even taking time for an hour's tennis after reporting to the president. And, of course, we all saw him playing tennis down in Argentina. Another story from the New York Times, the details of Hague's mission and when he realized it would fail. He realized it would fail several weeks before it failed. That's the truth. But he pretended that he was being the great diplomat, that he was the mediator, because then if things go down, he will get the credit for having tried. And that Hague is the fellow who thought he was in control of the government when Reagan was shot, and he's still pretty much running the scene. And there's a full-page ad in the Washington Post from a group. They call themselves the TFP. I don't know if you've ever heard of them or not. The American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property. Now, this group first originated down in Brazil. John Kennedy was murdered November 22nd, 1963, with a large connection of Nazis from Argentina, New Orleans, Dallas, and Washington, and New Jersey. And after Kennedy was killed in 63, in 1964, the government changed hands in Brazil. A military dictatorship was put into power. And at that time, there were articles about an organization that called themselves the TFP, Tradition, Family, and Property. Now, I have an article going back, it was from Reuters, on this organization, how it was formed. It was founded in 1960, the same year that Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon, not Reagan, Nixon, and got the nomination, and that time they knew he had to be killed. The master worked 20 years, planned the TFP, and it was against socialist tendencies in South America, and it combined the South American countries, and it was called the Brotherhood, simply like the Bormann Brotherhood, the Nazi Odessa Network, or the Brotherhood in South Africa. They called themselves the Brotherhood. They were founded in 1960, and they took over, and they were instrumental in Brazil in this military junta. They have jeweled crucifixes, palaces, priceless art. They call themselves the Hall of the Knights, thrones with wood carvings, and visitors in South America and Brazil from Chile, Cuba, Argentina, Uruguay, and the United States. Their symbol is the serpent's head. It's similar to the SLA, which I said the serpent's head was used because of the Nazi connections. Well, they serviced in Brazil. This was just at the time after the Kennedy assassination. They'd been working there since 1960, Tradition, Family, and Property. Now they're running a full-page ad in the Washington Post. Russian influence in the Falkland crisis, put out by the this Tradition, Family, and Property, and they're objecting to the Soviet Union contaminating a fascist junta that they've set up since 1960, and all of a sudden Russia comes in and says, we'll be your ally. And they're shaking their heads and they're saying, what in the heck is going on? And this article is, subtitle is The Independence of Catholic Argentina in Regard to the Effective Sovereignty over the Island Territories. And what the organization is saying, if in order to take the Falklands, you take Russia as your ally, then leave the Falklands with Great Britain. That they've done all this work with their armed forces, with the South American fascists. They don't call themselves fascists. They call themselves God-fearing, and they love God. And they say Argentina is a country predominantly Catholic, and the first commandment is the law of God, to love God. And if for love of territorial integrity we accept a coalition with the communists, who are the enemy of God, forget the Malvinas and go home. And it's an interesting thing because they've set this groundwork for so many years, from 1960 to 1982. That's that many years of getting South America into a Catholic bloc, and they say that the Argentines are 90% Catholic. And how can they sell the wheat? How can they trade with the Soviet Union, share technology? Well, the truth is that the church doesn't matter, the state doesn't matter, the country doesn't matter, money matters. And many times on this program I've quoted those marvelous lines of Paddy Chayefsky in Network, where he has the man saying, you know, there are no nations, there's corporations. The ITT and Dow Chemical and the petroleum corporations and so forth, the communications, the multinational corporations are where it's at. If the United States doesn't sell wheat to the Soviet Union buys it from Argentina. It simply has nothing to do with boundaries anymore, or who prays to who, or what God they have. The name of the game is money. There is no God except making a buck. That's how the Vatican went broke to the tune of $26 million a year, by blending their money with the Gambino family and organized crime to make more money. And this organization worked so hard to get almost what they wanted, and all of a sudden their allies are Cuba down there and the Soviet Union. And it's really funny because they're suffering from an identity crisis. What's happened to our American organization, our international organization in defense of tradition, family, and property? And the truth is that in order to make a buck, in order to survive, people are doing it in outrageous ways. They've lost their principles. They will trade and deal, and that is the name of the game, and that is the reality of the world today. The old alliances don't matter. If we can do business with South America and make more bucks, some of us would turn our back on Great Britain and our common goals. If they torture, if they kill, if they just don't like communists, we're their friends. But if they trade with communism, we're left with nothing. We fought Russia, now we're fighting Argentina. We have few friends, we'll have fewer as it goes on. This country has lost its scruples. I believe the worst that I saw in my lifetime was when John Kennedy was murdered and nobody cared who killed him, and began the wheeling and dealing, escalating with the war in Vietnam. Well, I wanted to do a lot more, but the Malvinas are really important. The Falklands are important because they're necessary to study for what the major media has kept from you in terms of technology, of military hopes for the area, how it'll be controlled, because the goal of Adolf Hitler and the Fourth Reich and the Bormann Brotherhood was to control the airways. The satellites, the space stations are more important even than any single armies. And those are the places where the launching can be done. Admiral Byrd said it in the 40s. It's been proven and tested down there, and that is why it's an important area. Next week we'll get on and update some of the more current news, but this is an important area to study, and so I've dwelled on it for the last 4 weeks to get the ground rules of the game. It is a mess, and it will get worse, but it's interesting to study it and read some of these books on the subjects as it goes on. In the meantime, you take care of yourselves, and this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.